To all the watchers, I'll address real quick. This is the Dark Sire Creative Nook on YouTube. I'm here with Corey Nyhus, an artist who lives in, I believe, New York. And we're here to talk about art, something that I know very little about. That self-portrait you see in the background is the last thing I made in terms of art, and that was in 8th grade. So I'm excited to hear about Corey, your art, your process, everything. So before that, you want to tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, sure. First of all, thank you guys so much for having me. I'm pretty straightforward person. I'm a burned out, aging hardcore kid who loves anime and cosmic horror and drawing monsters. Um, last year, for like the last year, I've been pretty silent on social media, I guess, because I've been finishing up my MFA and my graphic novel, which has been an extremely intense process. It's about carnivorous squid gods and the Great Depression. Yeah, and other than that, it's just drawing was a very meditative process for me at a young age, and it's something that I've tried to carry over to all these years and keep very close to me alongside my writing as well. So I kind of consider myself, I guess these days I kind of consider myself an author first, but I do have a very like diligent visual art practice as well.
Okay. Yeah, so carnivorous squid gods in the Great Depression, you said. I'm gonna have to check. Is that Bloom Breather or is that a different project?
Bloom Breather is a fantasy project. This one is called Unknown Superiors. It's actually going to be in the MFA thesis show through my university, FIT. I think that's coming up on June 10th. So I'll have like the first chapter up for reading online soon.
Okay, cool. For the viewers who don't know, Bloom Breather is a comic that Corey made. It's on his website. So I will. That's awesome. Good luck with the Squid comic and your MFA and everything. And I'm gonna start the interview with a pretty basic question. So when did you start creating art?
Since I was a kid, like I think 2 years old, I was drawing a bunch of wonky, distorted egg people on a chalkboard. And I was very encouraged heavily by family and later by teachers. And so I tried to never lose that like childlike sensibility that I got. But I think a lot of people have that creative impulse at that very young age. And it was interesting because I think at that age you're also extremely honest. And so I felt very lost visually a couple of years ago when I started my MFA and I really wanted to commit myself as an illustrator. And I was looking at all these pictures when I was like 5 or 6, and I would just fill up huge sketchbooks with like aliens fighting each other and just like getting into sword fights and like laser fights and stuff. And I'm looking at my stuff now and it has notes of that weirdly. I think I've gotten more sophisticated in terms of perspective and anatomy and stuff, but I think there's still like an interest in doing creatures and putting people in intense situations.
You can see like the shadows of your younger work and your newer work.
Yeah, definitely.
All right, that's very cool. So I saw your Instagram when I saw you on Novel Nocturnal, and then I went to your Instagram and looked at your art. All of it is very, very good. But one thing stood out to me, and that is a character that seemed to be like a recurring character called Red Boy, devil type figure. So would you go into like who Red Boy is, how did he come to be, what you plan to do with him, if anything?
Yeah, I think like a lot of the stuff that especially the stuff that I was kind of doing a couple years ago when I was really starting to fine tune my illustration process, I just had like so many dense images in my head, and I get a lot of vivid character images. I tend to see in very like highly saturated, unnatural color. So like the idea of having a character that had lots of reds and purples in his garb and stuff like that made sense to me at the time. And like the way I style him is sort of similar to a lot of the stuff that I grew up out of going to DIY shows and punk shows and stuff as a kid. Um, and so he's kind of got that side. He's not really autobiographical, but he ended up kind of becoming a de facto mascot for my online stuff for a while. I like the idea of having a character that's very aggressive and kind of ragey and aggro, but is also kind of a sweetheart, isn't necessarily violent. And I tend to draw him with this other character, Vanessa, who's like this owl creature. She's like bookish and likes to read. So the two balance each other out. And I was doing a lot of, there was like a kind of like a period, maybe for like a year, I was doing just a lot of spot illustrations with them as just a purely personal project. I wanted to see how far I can take like a little bit more of an editorial approach, not doing like a long form story, but just having little vignettes with characters. And so he was very helpful with that. Since I've been doing longer stuff, I haven't been drawing him as much, but I really want to go back to drawing him more. He's fun.
That's very cool. That he's like a little mascot to pop up in your works. That's cool. So, all right, awesome. So I'm gonna move on to another question and another work of yours called Kafkaesque. And I this is my personal favorite because I've read Metamorphosis by Kafka. I liked it, and so I saw that, I saw the caption, and I was like, oh, that's very good imagery, that reminds me a lot of the work, obviously. So anyway, how did that piece come to be, and how did it develop?
I'm a huge Kafka nerd. So like Metamorphosis is awesome. I've read a ton of his short fiction. I took a seminar in undergraduate also, so I've read all 3 of his novels too. I'm very, very into Kafka. And he's like my gateway into liking horror. I didn't have like a standard horror trajectory. I was always more of like a lit nerd who just liked reading a lot of graphic novels. And then Kafka just ended up getting me really into like modern weird fiction and stuff like that. And existential horror. And with that one, so I think that was like a time when I was thinking about ways to really push my hand lettering. I had a lot of faculty at FIT who were very, very into putting your penmanship into your work. And I just found like I never considered myself having the best handwriting, but I was very shocked when people would look through my sketchbooks and stuff, and they really responded well to the writing that I'd have alongside my images. And that was really kind of the first time that I really wanted to start playing with text and giving it a same kind of the same type of artistry that I would apply to a drawing. And so that just overall feeling of feeling trapped, having a critter on his back, I think works well with a lot of the, being crushed by bureaucracy in an alienating system that Kafka would write about a lot too.
Yeah, definitely. So the handwriting thing, it interests me. So is that a thing among artists and art scenes where having unique or interesting handwriting is something that is encouraged to be incorporated into art?
Really depends on the program. It's actually very interesting. I'd met someone who is maybe a little older than me recently, someone who's more of a fine artist, and she was doing a lot of images and text, but because she came from a bit more of a conceptual program, it was heavily discouraged. So I think for a while there was like this, there's always been these like weird moments back and forth where like in fine art it had been discouraged, but I'm obsessed with cartooning and comics, and I also grew up looking at the artist. He kind of is known as like a punk artist, but he's also a fine artist too, Ray Pettibon. And he did covers for like Sonic Youth, for Goo. He did a lot of Black Flag covers. And in his personal work, he does these massive drawings or small drawings, and there's always this automatic writing that he puts in. It's very poetic. A lot of it's very intense, and some of it's like barely makes sense. But he has like a very desperate in the moment sort of thing, and it really adds another dimension to his drawings, I think. And Molly Crabapple is a contemporary illustrator. She does kind of editorial stuff, but she also does a lot of like book illustration, and she's done like comics journalism where she'll just draw like scenes that she's doing investigative reporting on, and her writing and like her reflections will be kind of overlaid with those images. And in both of those artists, it's just like such a wonderful extra dimension. They're beautiful drawers also, but having that hand, it's just so recognizable that it's them. It gives them that extra voice.
That's interesting. I never considered that handwriting or writing could work like in an interweaving type and enhancing type of way with art. It's very interesting.
Yeah, for sure. I think it's a really good bridge between a really good way to bridge, I think, fiction and visual art also. I've definitely seen some more graphic novels over the years starting to bring in a little bit more of like a graphic quality with and making it a little bit more about the writing. Like I think Emily Carroll does that too, who's a cartoonist I love. She plays with type a lot, hand lettering and InDesign stuff, and it looks great.
That's very cool. I did some designing last semester, so that was my first venture into InDesign, um, and it was fun. So that's very interesting. Okay, so to a segue away from the handwriting, even though that's very very cool. I'd never heard that before. What about darker and horrific subjects, stuff like Corvian on your Instagram? Is more appealing to you than like human subjects and like earthly subjects, like still life type stuff?
So like there's like kind of two reasons, I guess, like why I tend to draw monsters. So one of it is because naturally I found that I could draw monstrous stuff way quicker than I could draw normal pretty people. And part of that is just the way my hand worked. I would distort things and screw up proportions really quickly, but kind of early on, I kind of liked the way it looked, and so I wanted to just hone into that. And I always still kind of commit myself to studying my anatomy and stuff, um, and I think as I've progressed in that kind of lane, as like my technical abilities of an artist have improved, I can do more interesting looking monsters too. I can make when I make monstrous features seem a bit more intentional. But yeah, part of it's just I think naturally when my hand worked, I was doing a lot of just distressing images, and I figured, hey, I can lean into this. Maybe there's something to it. I like it, and it was a nice surprise. But I also just I think there's so many artists that do a lot of very like pretty sort of like model type of stuff. It's not really what moves me. I don't really respond super well to it. I have always liked motifs of like a tragic monster or something like that in storytelling, and I think it's nice to have creatures that in my stories that aren't necessarily just like shocking or grotesque, but also have a kind of humanity to them, or at least have a kind of dignity to them. And I try to sneak that in ways to try to like complicate the creatures that I make too. I don't want them to just be one dimensional. But I think there's something really, I think we can see a lot of like things about the human condition through the way that we draw monsters.
I mean, that is the spirit of Frankenstein, right?
Yeah,
So
for sure.
I agree. Yeah, interesting. So uh onto okay. So you mentioned InDesign, but so I'm gonna ask, what tools or programs do you use to create your art, and how do those complement or act as conduits for your vision?
Yeah, I use all sorts of tools. I mean, I'm like very I go through phases with whether or not I work traditional or digital. I'm extremely comfortable working digital. I guess it's technically the oldest medium, I think, because I got like a little crummy tablet when I was like 10, and I like that was like just how I started working was like on I used to submit to like an Okaki board when I was a little kid, and just like a paint board forum. Um, but these days, I mean, the stuff that I like doing is a lot of stark inks and stuff like that. So I work with a lot of brushes and pens and markers and nibs. Um, for that stuff, I kind of like compositing work in my sketchbook. I'll just go crazy and just draw random things, and then I'll kind of jigsaw them together in Photoshop or Clip Studio after. So yeah, probably like for a digital workflow, it's for like a purely digital workflow, I just use Procreate now, and I don't use any fancy brushes. I just use like two brushes, and I'm very like uh not fancy with the way that I draw digitally. I if it's too many brushes, like there's so many like texture brushes, and I feel like I lose the plot very quickly. So I like to keep that way simpler. But yeah, other digital stuff and is just Photoshop, Procreate, Clip Studio, I guess, which I like better than Photoshop. It's cheaper too. And then I guess, yeah, InDesign too for text layout. It's great for kind of like putting together final PDFs and books and stuff like that.
Okay, interesting. That's cool. So next question is, how do you, which is a pretty standard question for artists, I think, but an interesting one nonetheless. How do you find yourself reflected in your work?
See myself reflected in my work. Well, definitely, there's definitely parts of, like I'd mentioned, there's definitely parts of like my personal style, like growing up loving punk and goth and metal culture, all that different stuff. There's definitely notes of that in my characters. Um, I think personally also, and I think I've written about this, I think in the past, but some of the creatures specifically that I had, I had like a long stretch where I did struggle with mental illness and mental health problems, like actual psychosis. And um, in my experience, the way that manifested occasionally were through like either forms of dissociation. And so I would constantly be in this sort of like hazy dreamlike state. And a lot of the times it would produce like very, very strong images. So like even then still like I'm perfectly healthy these days. Or at least as healthy as anyone else is. But um it I still have that very like very potent images, I guess, that have kind of maintained themselves from then. And so some of them are like apparitions or creatures and things like that. So I would always try to bring in notes of that. um, it's a very healing process for me too, I think, to get those images out and to put them into characters and to put them into environments and see them on the page. It kind of declutters my mind, I guess, and it's a way of healing from previous struggles. um,
Okay, that's very, yeah. Well, I'm glad you're doing well by post 2020 standards anyway. And that's, yeah, that's interesting. So uh next question is pretty simple. Who are some of your role models? What artists do you look up to?
yeah. Well, I know I mentioned before, I'd mentioned Molly Crabapple and Ray Pettibon. Those were like, in terms of people that do have a, you know, have kind of spans like a big career. They're awesome. Um, and one of my teachers, I'd probably say, who's also a very prominent, prolific illustrator and fine artist, Matt Rhoda, is awesome. He was my Photoshop teacher when I was taking continuing ed classes at SVA, when I was kind of in between undergrad and graduate school and figuring out what I wanted. And I was sort of dipping my toe into illustration again, and thinking, maybe I don't have to just focus on the writing and doing drawing on the side. Maybe I could do art more consistently. But I desperately needed a Photoshop workflow, and he was an incredibly useful teacher in that regards. One of the best teachers I've had. Um, but in addition to that, his work is awesome. Like he does a lot of really beautiful ink drawings. He works in very high chroma saturated colors when he brings it into Photoshop. He's also a kick-ass painter. Loves doing these sort of dreamy, ethereal, surreal sort of situations. They feel like a very modern take on like a Max Ernst or something like that, like something from the early, from that like post World War One art period in Europe. And um, so yeah, and he's just like constantly making stuff. So it's always great. And then probably one of my other teachers too, Lauren Burke, Lauren Simkin Burke, who doesn't really draw like me, but they were just such a gentle and incredibly inspiring soul that like it was they were just able to see something in my work and push me to do the things that I liked to do. They loved that I did these direct drawing ink drawings with monsters, and they were like, do that, do that, do that. Do an entire zine of it. Do 10 drawings of them. Do 20 drawings of them. So yeah, having that like constant like just an artist that I knew personally who was able to trust my instincts more, I think. And Lauren's somebody who's always making puppets or making like paper sculpture or making books or making zines and something, is always making finished products, and they're very intimately done. So that definitely translates to me, even though they're not a horror artist by any stretch of the imagination. They're a very joyous person. They make a lot of very beautiful, sensitive art.
Yeah, teachers are always the big ones, right?
Yep, for sure. I think it's indispensable. And bad teachers can really screw up somebody's creativity. I was super happy that I didn't have any bad teachers at the wrong time.
That's definitely true. Yeah. All right. So, on the other end of the spectrum, we talked about artists you enjoy. I'd like to talk about sources of inspiration for like basically the genre I suppose you work in. So what are some authors or pieces of horror, gothic, fantasy that you enjoy?
Yeah. So in terms of just like straight up, I'm gonna do one sheet. I'm gonna do a graphic novel also. I think for weird fiction, um, the cartoonist, I'm remembering his online name now, and I always forget his real name because his real name is long. But he does a comic called Kill 6 Billion Demons. It's superb. It's weird fiction, big cast of characters. It's one of the only comics running right now that has like a mostly monster cast of characters, which is also awesome. It's very difficult to find contemporary fantasy that really focuses on the monster stuff. He does, and he does it brilliantly. Um, I guess another one that does that that's like prose, probably like the best book that I've read in the last decade to come out recently was B. Catling's The Vor, which is I think like a full VORRH, I think. Um, and that one it's sort of a period piece. Um, it's an extremely strange like critique of imperialism. There's a cyclops in it. Um, there's strange androids in it. There's a forest that gives people a hive mind in it. Um, it's like a very dense, labored, surrealist novel that ended up kind of retroactively being marketed as like a horror book, and he was surprised. Like he was kind of surprised at the time. He's like, I thought I was doing a surrealist book, but then it ended up getting like picked up, like it ended up getting like championed by Alan Moore, and so it ended up kind of getting into that existential horror lane. It's beautiful in that regard. Um, and it's kind of like reading a Bosch painting, basically. It's wonderful. Um, I also think, and like I guess the short story artist that I always go to lately is Thomas Ligotti, who's my favorite eldritch horror writer, and he's still active. And his book Songs for a Dead Dreamer and Grim Scribe is constantly at my bedside. I love the way he constructs prose. I personally, I think he's a way better prose stylist than Lovecraft. Even though I like Lovecraft stories, it's as like an author, I think he brings a tremendous amount of artistry. And again, I love that so many of his stories are narrated first person from the perspective of the monster. He can really get into this sort of headspace that feels outside of humanity. It's a great read. Yeah, deeply inspiring writer, Thomas Ligotti.
So I scribbled all these down because the Vor especially sounds very interesting. I haven't read much surrealism other than Metamorphosis and some other stuff that I'm probably forgetting. But that sounds very, very cool. I'll definitely check that out. And Kill 6 Billion Demons. Also haven't read many comics. Check that out as well because it sounds awesome. I also love Lovecraft. But yeah, his prose is kind of dense and purple and hard to get through sometimes. But
Yeah,
I do love Lovecraft.
Yeah, Lovecraft's great.
So we're at the end for the most part here. So this final question is basically for you. Is there anything else you want to say to the watchers of the Dark Sire, the magazine, and any future pieces or projects you want to tease, talk about? Anything you want to talk about at all is the time now.
Yeah, I guess the only in terms of projects that I'm teasing, I think I'd mentioned at the beginning. I can say again. I think June 10th, I think, is the prospective date for the. It's an online gallery show that's going to be hosted through the Society of Illustrators. So it'll be hosting kind of my MFA cohort, who are also all remarkably talented illustrators and storytellers as well. And so yeah, you can go through the East Coast Society of Illustrators website, I guess, on the 10th. and then my story, Unknown Superiors, like the first 10 pages of that graphic novel will be up, and some illustrations that I've done along with that as well. So yeah, that's the project that I've really been very much building up. And I have, yeah, my Instagram is at coma.nidus, and then my portfolio site is corynyhusart.com. And I'm going to be updating that with a lot of new stuff that I can finally catch up on because I've graduated now and I can actually have time to update my online presence again.
Congratulations on graduating. Congratulations on the gallery. I'll be checking that out. And if that is all, then that concludes the interview, I suppose. Thank you for zooming in. I appreciate it a lot.
I appreciate the time very much. Thank you.
Of course. So to the watchers, I'm Zack Shiffman. This has been Cory Nyhus, an artist, and a very talented one. This has been the Dark Sire Creative Nook on YouTube, and that concludes this interview. Cory, thanks again. And yeah, that's it. Good luck with everything.
Yeah.
Bye.
Shout out to the Dark Sire readers too. You guys rock.
Bye.